U.S. History 2323, Lecture Overview, The Cold War. Okay, Cold War, you saw the definition of it at least on that first slide. Hostility on the verge of conflict. But the word itself, Cold War, comes from Bernard Baruch. There were some issues that occurred during the war that caused the American-Russian relationship to be disrupted some. The first is the second front delay. They thought D-Day was delayed on purpose because the Nazis were at the Russians' doorstep killing Russian communists, and the Russian communists were killing Nazis, and so they thought we were, the Allies, Britain, France, US, were delaying on purpose. Also, remember, Italy's government fell, Mussolini's government fell, so the post-Mussolini government was put in place by basically Churchill and FDR without consulting with Stalin, and so that's also going to be a snub. So there's other issues which aren't going to be huge. You can see that the Russians weren't treated as well as the French or the British were treated, but the Americans didn't treat them as well, the Russians as well as they did their closer allies. 3 summits during the war: Tehran, which promised that second front, which did happen in June of '44, and then in return, the Russians promised to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Hitler's surrender. Then in February of '45, you have Yalta, which is in Russia, and there the whole United Nations apparatus is planned. The treaty will eventually be created and signed in San Francisco in April. Also laid out that there's going to be spheres of influence. The Russians did not want to be attacked by Europeans again, so they wanted to have a little buffer states of pro-Russian governments in Eastern Europe. Between February and July, when we get to Potsdam, you have 2 new leaders because FDR dies in April and Churchill is voted out of office in the summer, and so Truman and Attlee are the new leaders with Stalin at Potsdam. This is where the dividing up of Germany occurs and the splitting in half of the city of Berlin. The person most responsible for coming up with the containment policy is going to be George F. Kennan. He believed that communism was expansive by nature, and so the way you counter that is through containing it. Other issues: Churchill gave a speech where he talks about an iron curtain falling down the middle of Europe. On one side you have freedom, on the other side you have communism. When that Poland fell at the beginning of World War II, that government fled to London, but in the post-war period, the Russians did not want to have a non-communist government there, so they set up one called the Lublin government. And so the London government, I think one person got to go back, and that was it. So the communists more or less maintained their control of Poland and all of Eastern Europe because of the Red Army, the Russian army going through there first. You'll see that Eastern Europe goes communist. Now we have the bomb, so Truman's it's in his interest to keep it secret. That's going to be this Atomic Energy Commission, which eventually will become part of the United Nations job, is to try to stop the spread of atomic and now nuclear weapons everywhere. Truman will come up with 3 policies to implement containment. Truman Doctrine, which is aid to Greece and Turkey, the Marshall Plan, which is helping to rebuild Western Europe, and then NATO, which is a military alliance with Canada, US, and Western Europe. The Soviets get their bomb faster. We thought it would take 10 years. It took 4, and that will produce an arms race where now you're trying to build bigger and better bombs than your opponent. 2 wars in Asia emerge between communists and non-communists. China, you have Mao and Chiang. Now, they had been fighting in the 20s and the 30s, but once Japan attacks China in 37, they join forces to fight the Japanese. But after Japan's defeated, then they start their civil war again. Mao will win, and then Chiang's nationalist forces will flee to Taiwan, which becomes the Republic of China, and then the mainland part of China will become the People's Republic of China, which is Communist China. Okay, the People's Republic of China is because it's going to be 1950. The next, well, they're going to recognize already Ho Chi Minh as the leader of Vietnam. And remember, in Indochina, the French are trying to reestablish their colony there. So in 1950, they recognize the French will set up Bao Dai as this puppet emperor to try to, because they've been fighting the war for 4 years now and they're losing against the Ho Chi Minh's army, General Vo's army and Ho Chi Minh. But Bao Dai is recognized as the leader of Vietnam by the U.S. So this is again getting us, because we're going to be in this war in earnest in a bit. And then the National Security Council will issue NSC 68, which now makes containment not just in the crucial places of the world, but in every corner of the world. And this is why we're going to end up in places like Vietnam and South Korea. There was this belief in the domino theory that if one nation falls to communist, then those around it will also tumble. So the Korean War begins in 1950. Kim, you got to know who's a communist and who's a nationalist here. Kim Il-sung is the communist. That's the granddad of the current leader of North Korea. And Syngman Rhee is the South Korean, so the non-communists. And so the North attacks the South on June 25th, and they push them all the way down what's called the Pusan Perimeter, and almost push them into the ocean. The war would have been over. But the United Nations declared that it was the aggressor was North Korea, and so this becomes known as the First United Nations War. Under the top commander was Douglas MacArthur. Now, it's a UN war, but 90% of the troops are American. MacArthur needs to figure out some way of getting behind the enemy, and so he does what's called this Incheon landing. It's an amphibious assault near Seoul, South Korea. That will be very successful. Pushes the North Koreans all out of South Korea all the way back up to the Yalu River, which is the border with China, and then you have a couple 100,000 Chinese will invade North Korea and push everybody back down again below Seoul. So the war is going back and forth. But this is where you have the famous showdown between MacArthur and Truman. MacArthur wants to bomb China for entering the war, Chinese cities with atomic weapons. Truman says no, and that's going to lead to the firing of MacArthur. Eventually, the war will be pushed back to, it's the 38th parallel where it started, just north of Seoul, and the negotiations begin at Panmunjom, and we still have, to this day, around 30,000 U.S. troops on that border who've been there since 1953. So the war is officially not over. It's just going to be a ceasefire, basically. The Cold War pattern, we will never fight with all of our might. We have to fight limited wars now. We haven't declared war since World War II. The president can wage a war with just the authority he has as commander-in-chief. And we usually try to create an appearance of international support, even though it's usually an almost all-American war. Okay, second Red Scare. This will occur aftermath of World War II, and that's going to be just like the first irrational fear of communism. And you have a lot of people being accused of it. And remember, there's no crime in being a communist in America. You just have to say you are. You can't lie under oath. That's perjury. The face of this second Red Scare is a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. He makes a speech at Wheeling, West Virginia, which will again scare people because he says there's 205 communists in the State Department and stuff like that without much evidence, and that's going to lead to hysteria in some cases. Truman will launch his fair deal, and that will be job. If you don't have a job, there'll be benefits or help assistance. Made it easier to buy a house with low interest loans. Civil rights improvements. We have in two ways here. You have desegregation of the military, and then desegregation of the major leagues with Jackie Robinson. Truman is supposed to lose in 48 against Republican Dewey, but Truman will squeak it out and win re-election. Okay, domestic here. I think for the most part you can read through these. Things with Eisenhower, you naturally have a baby boom after wars. The highway, 50,000 or 40 to 50,000 miles of highways are laid during this decade of the 50s. TV shows, lots of consumerism. The first malls are created. rock and roll becomes popular. You can see the feminism, environment movement, and then civil rights we'll talk about shortly in the next few lectures. And then in Cold War, you basically, the Korean War is over, but you'll have issues with countries teetering on falling to communism. So remember, John Foster Dulles is going to be Ike's Secretary of State, who believes in the domino theory and in brinkmanship, which means pushing up to the edge of everything. And so we have a huge nuclear arsenal. We are assuming that mutual assured destruction, that's what MAD means, would prevent the Russians from firing first because we will destroy them before their rockets hit us, etc. And you'll see when we get to JFK that that's going to be, he's going to want more options than just using nuclear weapons. We have a race in space as well. This will be, the Soviets will be the first one in space. Sputnik is the first object in space. And Yuri Gagarin is the first human in space. But NASA is born and the whole race to the moon begins. Eisenhower's VP, Vice President, is Nixon, and he has a famous debate with Nikita Khrushchev, who's the new leader after Stalin, called the Kitchen Debate. Then you have an American spy plane shot down, Francis Gary Powers, and he survives, and that's going to be problematic because we're flying spy planes over the Russia. Then you'll have other things in your textbook. You'll see we take out the leader of Iran. We take out the leader of Guatemala. There will be uprisings against communism in Hungary. The Suez Crisis with in Egypt when Nasser nationalizes the canal. There's the Sputnik again, and then the U-2 crisis that were mentioned.